morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Junaid Badger. I'm the Chief Medical Scientist at Microsoft Research, and I'm also the Head of Global Scientific and Regulatory Affairs within the Health Futures team at Microsoft Research. On behalf of Microsoft and our Research Summit, I'm really excited to welcome you to our Health Futures Forum discussion on responsible, equitable, and ethical AI in the context of health and life sciences. AI and machine learning technologies truly have the potential to transform health and life sciences research, and indeed goes some way to augment our capacity to deliver precision medicine and precision care. However, making sure that AI systems are developed and deployed responsibly, equitably, and ethically, especially in healthcare, is one of the toughest challenges facing AI researchers and practitioners. Many questions arise as we consider the deployment of AI into real-world settings. For example, what are the principles that are needed to guide the deployment of AI monitoring of AI and machine learning in healthcare? How best can we regulate AI systems? And what are the ways that we can engage the broader community of practitioners as AI technologies are used in real-world settings? In today's session, we have a chat with three amazing global leaders in their field who come from a mixture of regulatory, innovation, researcher backgrounds, and clinical backgrounds themselves. I'm delighted to introduce Dame June Rain, CEO of the MHRA in the UK, Trishan Panch, entrepreneur, clinician, and faculty member at the Harvard School of Public Health, and Amy Abernathy, president at Alphabet's Verily. And I'll ask them to do a deeper introduction into their background shortly. June, if I could first come to you, thank you again for taking the time to join us here today. I'd love for the audience to learn a little bit more about you and your career to date. And perhaps you could share with us a little bit of who the MHRA are to this global audience, and let us know a little bit about what you're doing in the space of AI.
Thank you very much indeed, Junaid, for this great opportunity to participate in a panel at this very timely research summit. Well, like my fellow panelists, I trained in medicine and I followed research in clinical pharmacology, after that specialising in family practice. And it was there I discovered my public health driver, which led to a career focus on patient safety in relation to medical devices and medicines. My present role as the CEO of the UK's Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency has been a tremendously exciting opportunity to strengthen regulation. And you don't often hear the words exciting and regulation in the same sentence. The MHRA is currently responsible for ensuring that medicines and medical devices like software and AI meet applicable standards of safety, of quality, and of effectiveness, promoting international standardization, and importantly, informing the public and healthcare professionals about risks and benefits, and contributing to the development of UK and international regulatory frameworks for medical products so they stay relevant as technology, medicine, science continue to advance. So where are we now? There's no question we're in the midst of unprecedented change in healthcare. The regulator has been centre stage, if you like, as we've introduced new approaches to delivering safe innovation for patients. And so what I'd like to say in relation to AI and the organisational transformation that we're putting in place is that we're building a new concept as an enabler rather than a watchdog, an enabling regulator that works in partnership, not in isolation, while all the time retaining independence. And a great example of partnership working, one we're pretty proud of, is the collaboration with the US FDA and Health Canada, which produced the guiding principles for good machine learning practice for medical device development. These 10 guiding principles quite simply lay the foundation for developing good machine learning practice that takes into account the unique nature of these products. These principles identify areas where the International Medical Devices Regulators Forum and the other international standards organisations can get together and collaborate, including on research. So the clear message from our side is that as the AI and machine learning field evolves, so must best practice and consensus standards. So that brings us bang up to date, I hope.
Thank you. And if I may, just quick follow-up. I mean, you've spoken a little bit about how you're collaborating with global regulators, which I think would be welcome news to much of the audience, and understanding how we can create both harmonization and collaboration so that innovation can naturally scale. What help do regulators need from either academia or industry as you start to think about the regulation of responsible AI technologies?
Well, clearly, as an exciting new technology that's going to, we hope, all hope, deliver massive patient benefit, it also poses novel challenges for regulators such as the MHRA. But here in the UK, we've got an overburdened health system, we've got lots more demand, increasing costs, and limited supply. So we've got an urgency to develop an appropriate framework for AI. It's part of the solution. It can greatly help with the issues we're facing. And we know what amazing strides have been made in imaging, radiology, histopathology, etc. So we've been involved ourselves in supporting software and AI products getting to market. The AI reader for the NHS lateral flow tests, for example, contact tracing apps across the nations to get them into the hands of the public. So what is it that we really need? And I think, let's be honest here, there are not yet settled data science and regulatory science questions that we don't have a definitive answer for yet. And so we really want, as we talk to academia and industry, to get a collaborative approach so that we can adapt, all of us, to ensure this technology gets to the bedside. As a patient safety regulator, our primary concern is safety, but it's also access. And I think we're talking about building it as we fly this plane. So we really need that collaborative approach to put the science, the bedrock of good regulation, into place.
Thank you, June. That's awesome. And if we now start to think about the notion of ethical practices within AI, Trishan, I wonder if I could move to you a little bit and if you could give us an outline of some of your career to date, and indeed maybe a short plug to an article that you wrote around this notion of distributed approach to the regulation of AI. But before we come to that, maybe we could hear a little bit about you, your background, your thoughts in this space.
Thanks, Junaid. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I mean, it's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks very much for the invite. I think, it's somewhat appropriate that I'm between June and Amy, whose work and careers I've followed obviously for some time, but equally, the first kind of decade, I suppose, of my career was spent in the UK, hence the accent. And I was a primary care physician as well, risk-based primary care in London. The second decade, the second half, I suppose, has been here in the US, which is where I am now, in Boston, Massachusetts. And in the middle was a stint at Harvard School of Public Health. And in that, we started a digital health company back in 2011, but we kind of started in earnest in 2012. And we grew that. That was Wellframe. We went through the kind of classic venture-backed route, and then we sold that to Blackstone Health Edge back in 2021. And at the end of last year, sorry. And since then, I've been focusing a lot on the kind of academic side of what I've been doing. I've been doing that in the background a little bit. There was an obvious intersection because I think there's a bunch of really conceptually interesting things in digital health, how you do evaluation with an alternative to clinical trials that don't really work very well for a technology that's being continually updated. Of course, although it's very necessary to look at the questions that clinical trials are looking to answer to exclude known confounders, but how do you exclude unknown confounders? How do you do that in an agile way that works with software development? What are some of the broader issues in scaling technology? I mean, these, I think, are all, I would argue, not just conceptually interesting, but also inherently public health issues. And I'll kind of come on to that in a second. So since we sold Wellframe, I've been focusing a little bit more on that side. I'm now the president of the Alumni Association at Harvard School of Public Health, and I'm an instructor there. We run a number of courses, one of which Junaid, you teach on. We're very happy to say, and Lisa also from Microsoft, as well as a number of other folks from Google and Amazon and across industry, which is applied AI in healthcare. And I'm generally now looking a lot at these issues of upskilling the clinical workforce, but also the leadership workforce in terms of digital literacy. And very much looking at digital transformation of healthcare organizations, very much in the spirit of what June is saying, representing a national organization, but also smaller ones, individual practices, groups of practices, private payers, public payers. There's a real need for the people running those organizations to have a bit more understanding of this kind of set of methods so they can work more productively with organizations such as the one that Amy represents or the one that I used to in the past. And so we believe that's a really interesting area. And there's a lot of things that we're doing in what was previously kind of called exec ed. We're looking at more of a lifelong learning model for people running healthcare organizations, something I'm working on, but equally at the master's level as well. Obviously, at Harvard School of Public Health, we have a MPH and PhD program. So that's kind of what I do now. It's a bit more of a kind of portfolio thing. But yeah, so with respect to that specifically, so with some of my long-term collaborators here at Harvard and MIT, particularly Leo Celli, who was the founder of the MIMIC program, which is the largest kind of open access healthcare data set for machine learning, and Felix Greaves, who has a position at the National Institute of Care Excellence in the UK, as well as at Imperial. We looked at a really kind of practical problem in that, like, with the growth of these machine learning technologies, there's a fundamental volume problem in terms of the regulation of these technologies. Even if you kind of take aside kind of what could be considered technical issues, but very practical issues of, some of these things are kind of local by design, if you will, and looking at things that generalize across national populations may be giving up very useful local clinical applicability. And we wrote a paper 2 years ago in Lancet Digital Health with some colleagues of ours at Harvard on the myth of generalizability in AI medicine, I believe it is. But equally, even if you ignore that and you just look at things that are regulated centrally, if you look at software as a medical device from the FDA, I know Amy and others were very involved in that pioneering regulation that kind of set the playing field here in the US. And even if you just look at approvals, things coming out the other side, so not inputs, but outputs from that. In the paper we described, which is open access, I hope it will be kind of linked here, it's in PLOS Digital Health. We found that there was 5 approvals in 2015, so obviously kind of this early in the process. In 2020, which we obviously wrote the paper in 21, that was the last year we had data, there was 95 approvals. Now from that, using a lot of kind of, I would argue, quite shaky assumptions, I assumed a kind of linear function of extrapolation, and then felt if you have that, then there'd be 185 in 2025 and 274 in 2030. So that's obviously a tripling of the output of regulation. Now, I think a linear function is a massive underestimate because technology typically shows an exponential growth, especially when we're at this kind of point. So that's at least a tripling of the resources to regulate these things centrally. That's assuming that central regulation is optimal, which I would argue for things where, maybe it's more kind of smaller units, smaller healthcare units, maybe individual hospitals or individual clinicians, even in a distant future, but some kind of more local collection, maybe in partnership with organizations such as Verily or others who are working with healthcare organizations to optimize pre-trained algorithms on local populations or retrain them on local populations to produce locally optimal results. Even if you don't necessarily buy the volume problem of doing things centrally, it may not be optimal for things that should be retrained and reproduced and reiterated on locally. So our paper about this distributed approach is kind of discussing that as a problem. We had folks from the FDA, we had folks from academia, from the UK and the US, and then proposing this method, which we called a distributed method for dealing with it. But of course, we have to say, June is in the hot seat. She has to deliver results. Amy, likewise, is in an organization where they have responsibility both internally and to shareholders. We are merely pontificating. So it's very easy to do that. And I appreciate there's lots of considerations on either side, but we just put it forward there for debate, and I kind of introduce it here likewise. And yeah, look forward to the discussion. No. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. And we'll come back to it. I think you raised some interesting points around both supply and demand mismatch. How do you manage the ever-increasing demand for the regulators on this? At the same time, you also have an exponential number of drugs coming in for licensing, approval. And June, you and I have spoken in the past in terms of if you were going to boil down things around the regulator, one, does the product, service, or innovation do what it says? So does it actually work? And two, how do you ensure patient safety, not just for the purposes of approval, but what happens in the real world as well? I think that poses quite an ethical challenge and a delivery challenge within that. And more so, if I think about the ethics of this, we also have to ensure reliability of whatever these models are, that they work. And in healthcare, I don't believe you can take chances. And some degree of transparency upon which what have these models actually been built on, and how do any regulatory standards groups or people who take accountability for regulation have assurance that once deployed, they work like they're supposed to in the real world. And maybe we can come back to some of this and the nuances around it shortly. Amy, if I can come to you now, please, if I may, and both welcome you and ask you to perhaps introduce yourself and a little bit about your eclectic background. You seem to have had multiple careers in a single lifetime, and I'm sure the audience would love to learn more.
So thank you, and it's a delight and honor to be with all of you here today. Well, so like the rest of the panel, I'm a physician by background as well. I'm an oncologist. And when I was taking care of patients in the clinic, I'm a melanoma doctor, I was really motivated, sometimes horrified by really this issue that we were developing potentially life-saving medical products in our laboratories, actually on both sides of my clinic, and the length of time it would take for meaningful, safe, and effective products to get to the people who would need them. And that was really the motivating factor for pretty much everything across my career. So when I was at Duke University as a professor of medicine, I was also running something called the Center for Learning Healthcare, where we were trying to understand how do you line up evidence development and understanding how new treatments perform and the delivery of those treatments so that that was much more facile and connected and continuously learning. As I was doing my work at Duke, what I realized was we hit a ceiling, especially as it related to the ability to scale and the ability to build the kinds of software and data capabilities that were needed to pull that off. I then went to a company called Flatiron Health in New York City, where I was the chief medical officer and chief scientific officer. And what we were doing was developing solutions to curate, to clean up electronic health record data in the cancer space, to be able to create data sets that reflected care delivery. So real-world data sets that then could be used for a variety of research tasks, including regulatory grade decisions. And that work then led to a lot of activity in the real-world data and real-world evidence side. I worked on 21st century cures in the United States, and ultimately Flatiron Health was bought by Roche in 2018. And as I was scratching my head trying to decide what was the next thing to do, I realized that really the regulatory function, regulation, and an agency like the Food and Drug Administration as a science-based public health agency is an incredible public health mechanism to drive forward the development of safe and effective treatments. And so I went to FDA in February of 2019 as Principal Deputy Commissioner and was there. I also became the Chief Information Officer, and I'll come back to the reason why in just a second, and was at FDA until April of last year. I joined Verily as president of clinical research platforms about 15 months ago. And the reason why I did this is because I could see in the middle of the pandemic that our ability to develop new solutions is really unbelievable. But our clinical trials capabilities are circa 1995. How we think about evaluating medical products is still not based on the best of what's possible with respect to data and technology, and that's what we're really focused on at Verily. Verily itself is one of the alphabet companies, as you mentioned, and we are a company focused on unlocking the promise of precision health for everyone every day. If that's going to be true, we're going to need to leverage AI-based solutions. We're going to need to build those solutions. We need to leverage solutions to do tasks like building better evidence generation capabilities. And we also need to make sure that the work we're doing is fair and equitable and represents all people. And we'll come back to that. The last thing I thought
Brilliant.
I would say in reference is the thing that I saw at FDA and goes along with what we've just been talking about with June and Sean kind of hit on this, was that if we have an increasing number of SAMD products, we have more and more cell and gene therapies and other treatments, the regulatory tasks are scaling quickly, and we need to build the regulatory functions to go along with those scaling tasks. And so when I was at FDA, we put forward the data and tech modernization action plans to build the agency in modern ways to be able to keep pace And then as I've come to Verily, I've really focused on how do we build new evidence generation capabilities that can also evaluate these products and also evaluate them longitudinally across their life cycle, much of which requires sophisticated computation and AI.
Thank you, Amy. I mean, there's so much there, and if I could pick up on one of the things you mentioned was this notion of equity, which I think has become even more apparent through the pandemic, and it's clearly been of interest for people with a public health background, or indeed people looking at population health more broadly. I often hear about responsible AI as a generic term, but I think within healthcare, we must extend that to truly think about the equity of healthcare, the ethics of healthcare, and this notion of responsibility alongside. How do you think about equity broadly, and how do you think about it in the context of the development of AI tools?
So as I think about this concept of equity broadly, it means that our healthcare delivery systems and the treatments and interventions that are being developed need to be able to work for all people. And as we have systems that bias or leave people out, we are both not equitable and also not fair. And so as we think about what we need to do, we need to actually look towards how do we solve the gaps. And that means first we have to recognize that gaps exist. Gaps exist in data, gaps exist in process, gaps exist in healthcare delivery, and learn how to bridge those gaps and do so in ways that don't call into question whether or not we should be doing it, but make sure that it is true that we are just doing it because that's the right way to deliver healthcare. Practically speaking, it means we need to solve for data gaps and be able to develop more appropriate and representative data sets, and also be able to measure and solve for bias. It means we need to develop solutions for process gaps. So how do we make sure that our solutions represent all people, but also reach all people? And then we also need to develop better solutions towards transparency, so we are able to understand what people need, but also talk in a way and communicate in a way and reach people in a way that is aligned so that they can actually, each person, say, this is what I need, what I want from my personal health care in a way that represents my personal values.
Brilliant. And I think as I think about what you've all have said, it's not just doing the right thing, which could be the innovation, the invention, but it's how we do it. So doing it in the right way is going to be critically important. And then in addition to that, thinking about the evidence that we supply around it. Bringing you together now as a real panel, I suppose. I saw Trishan writing furiously a few things, and I'll probably bring him in for some commentary shortly. But there's clearly a supply and demand challenge. So we know that there's a tsunami of innovation coming our way from academia, from industry, from homegrown opportunities within the provider landscape as well. Yet I don't know if the regulators are necessarily funded to deliver against all of this massive ambition in that ecosystem. So you could argue this notion of distributed regulatory systems may be something for us to think about. If we take that as an initial topic, June, maybe if I could come to you, any initial views or thoughts on that, and maybe taking in some of the learning from the pandemic, where the UK, correct me if I'm wrong, was amongst the first in the world to really deeply look at the mRNA vaccines that have never been produced in this way before, and think about how do you safely regulate them. And I know you and I have said this before, but I often wonder whether we're in a large real-world evidence study even today with mRNA vaccines, and we're continually reviewing the safety profile of them. If that is true, then actually the central regulator truly has a role around innovation. But maybe I could come to you with your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Concept of getting innovation safely to patients in the shortest possible time was never more in our spotlight as in the pandemic. And it meant, I think the old saying is that the people who do best in the face of a challenge aren't the strongest, toughest, smartest, they're the most flexible. And therefore every flexibility was brought to bear within the laws that we have. The question I think that we're now talking about with software as a medical device, AI, is how we adapt even further. And we often talk about risk proportionality, not one size fits all. So we've got to drive that to its fullest potential. There are many, dare I say it, products coming through that aren't that high risk. And therefore, in terms of Trishan's thoughts about a distributed model, we already have the ability to bring on board approved bodies, formerly called notified bodies, that would take away more simple and straightforward and we've been here before type work, not to dismiss it at all, it's really important. But then the regulator is focusing on the high risk, where we want to get stuff through to the patient, to the bedside quickly, and the uncertainties are greater. And in that scenario, we're bringing on board, as Amy's saying, some really great data generation tools. The one doesn't go without the other. The way we were able to introduce mRNA vaccines quickly in the shortest time we needed was because we had those data generation tools. We had them in place 6 months before we approved, and that was the priority. Greater uncertainty, a real drive to generate data. And I think with some of those principles, we can employ them for the amazing opportunities we have now. It's not to dismiss what Trishan is saying at all. It is a tsunami, but we should embrace it and run to it.
Amazing. And Trishan, before I come to you, I'm going to come to Amy, just both with her previous hat and her current hat, maybe thinking through what are your thoughts or reflections, Amy, just on the provocation, I suppose, that Trishan poses.
So first of all, the provocation is in response partly to, as you pointed out, Trishan, the scaling number of SAMD solutions. But June also pointed out another point of scale that's in front of us that makes this even more complex, which is the evaluation of medical products multiply across their life cycle. So as you pointed out with the COVID vaccines, we're now continuously evaluating them, including asking questions of duration of effectiveness and safety, and do you need a booster, and can you mix and match, and myocarditis, all of these questions. And so the multiplicity is the scaling number of products and the scaling number of evaluation time points for any given product. And so, practically speaking, we're going to need solutions, whether that's distributed evaluation and regulation or new ways of evaluating the solutions that put that to test. A couple of observations. The first is the pandemic did teach us that we can regulate in new ways. And as June said, within the confines of the law, and it's very important that we keep that in mind. But as we develop flexible and new ways of regulating, one of the things I saw at FDA was the importance of not only regulatory flexibility, but what I call building regulatory muscle. So as we start to think about more flexible ways of regulating, allowing multiple groups, public-private partnerships with regulators at the table to say, here's what I trust, here's what I don't trust, here's what I need to see in order to have confidence and do this differently. And that's a very important aspect as we develop new regulatory approaches. And some of that, for example, was tested out in some of the pilots that the center responsible for regulating SAMD products at FDA, CDRH, really was pushing forward in the pre-certification pilot. Really just asking the question, how do we pressure test regulating in new ways, and what does that teach us? Another thing that I've seen and I think a lot about is our products, like our SAMD products, often are based on data and give off data. So if we're thoughtful about these products, we can also be thoughtful about their continuous evaluation through the data that is generated. And so developing solutions for continuous evaluation of performance is pretty critical. And I think that product developers can incorporate that in what they're doing. And so I encourage us to both have regulatory creativity, but also for manufacturers to have creativity as well.
Trishan, if I can come to you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't disagree with that actually. I mean, so yeah, I mean, of course, we're kind of like splitting for kind of effect, I suppose. Like, I mean, there's a lot that we agree on here. Is okay. So I think, I mean, those 2 points, like each one in turn that's made. So one, of course, yes, like proportionality. So based on risk. So things that are likely to be delivered in an entirely autonomous fashion, or are designed to be delivered in an autonomous fashion, or things that are national by design for automation of national screening programs, for example. Like those things should clearly look more like a drug or a medical device, and they should go through that process. And typically organizations that are doing that have the industrial scale to do it. And I don't think there's certainly no debate from me or my other kind of academic colleagues in that area. I think Amy raises a very important point, which I think is a real challenge for regulation, and it was brought up with software, prior to any use of machine learning, just purely kind of deterministic pre-programmed software, is the kind of agile development methodology that's kind of core to all software generation these days. Necessarily involves regular reiteration. So once something is evaluated or approved, and if it's applied on one population, then it's the job of the organizations that we all work for, actually, the organization that's convening this panel, to try and continuously improve that software, and in hiring people who are very good at that. But then that's a very interesting regulatory question. So that software, after 5 iterations, is it the same as that thing that was regulated in the first place? Or does it need to be redone? If so, how often? And what level of data is applicable for that? Now, if you're going to go purely kind of canonically, I suppose, by the textbook, and you're going for like randomized controlled trials, or even aggregations of randomized controlled trials, or even higher standard, that's kind of just, there aren't the resources for that. Certainly, I can't think of any real examples where anyone's done multiple randomized controlled trials over time to evaluate software as it's being reiterated. And rather than that, what you have is individual organizations and vendors coming to an agreement that, well, yeah, it's kind of roughly the same, and we trust you and we'll work with you. And that element of trust and partnership working that I know is core to Microsoft, it's core to all organizations that have been able to do this at scale. It's what we did at WellFrame, I think, is absolutely key here. It's like partnership for digital transformation. And that involves kind of navigating these gray areas, or these areas where regulation can't really give you guidance. And even if these things are nationally regulated, as they continually evolve, there's some amount of uncertainty there. And I would argue it's necessarily always going to be that way, just because of this volume problem. And then I think the other issue that we haven't discussed as yet, but is very real, is like, what about kind of a more distant future where you have, and I think it's a future that many people, certainly the laboratory of computational physiology that I joined at MIT, it was back in 2011, they had this vision that you could have ICU data sets locally that were aggregated, and you could have local coalitions of data scientists and clinicians working together to develop prognostication models, prediction models, or classification diagnostic models for local populations. And they wouldn't necessarily be generalizable, but they would be optimized for that local population, and they could be implemented that's a really cool vision. And I remember back as a student, when I first heard about that, I'm like, this is the future of medicine. It's like clearly what should happen. But in that kind of world, that's very difficult to look at. Even, any of the approaches to regulation that we've discussed, it's very, very tricky to incorporate those cases, especially at scale. So I think, that was kind of one of and I would argue that ICU is probably ahead of other fields in terms of, because it's obviously just by design very data rich, and the work of Mimic and the lab for well over a decade now has catalyzed that. I'm sure a lot of people watching this would have used Mimic. I believe there's still like 3 papers published every single week on the Mimic dataset, and that's been the way for the last decade. But imagine that, rather than people doing it as their PhDs or their research work, postdocs working in industry, it's actually individual healthcare organizations developing that themselves. Now that is it's really cool from a clinical point of view. I think for patients, it's really cool. It's like a really great vision of like data-informed medicine that I think is very much in keeping with like some of the personalized medicine and even like learning system visions of the Institute of Medicine, etc., and some of the bodies locally. But it's a really complicated regulatory issue, and I think that's the kind of spirit of how we're thinking about this, kind of very much in the long range. I mean, I think in the short term, the medium term, I agree with everything that's been said. And I guess in the long term, we'll all figure it out. But we're just kind of posing those questions.
No, there's so much in this discussion, and I'm sure we could write multiple papers on it and have longer discussions. I know when I've had the privilege of having one-to-ones with you, 45 minutes doesn't seem long enough before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of some of these things. And it's probably worth us just pausing just before we collectively close to say the regulatory aspect is only one part of the wider health innovation ecosystem. You need providers to be set up for whatever the innovation that's been regulated to do their best work. We need to really engage public, patients, and society so that they understand how some of these innovations are being deployed and the impact that they're having with them. And so I think that there's that wider healthcare system debate that we perhaps need to have on a separate occasion around what needs to change across not just regulation, but the innovation provider environment and indeed the patient public trust aspect of things in order for some of these innovations to truly see the light of day. And as we close, perhaps I could try to bring us back around this notion of responsible, equitable, ethical AI. And if we could futurecast for a moment, what would be any key asks or recommendations that you would have for this research, big tech community, that if you had one ask, one call to action, if you will, what would that be? Perhaps, Trishan, I could come to you first.
Well, okay, so I really strongly believe in two things. Well, I mean, I believe in a number of things, but the two things that are relevant here. It's so the first is that the best ideas come from the margins. Obviously, I'm kind of an entrepreneur at heart here. I'm also an immigrant, so I have some kind of bias there. But I believe that's fundamentally true, and it's the job of big tech, it's even the job of regulators to try and make sure there's, exactly as June said, that there's a path for those things to reach scale, there's a path for those ideas to be supported. I also really believe that the digital transformation, particularly kind of cloud transformation, is a really, I would say it's going to, in future, looking back, it's going to be considered similar to kind of sanitation infrastructure. Data infrastructure is just going to be essential healthcare infrastructure. And it would seem eccentric for our future selves looking backwards that wasn't thought of in kind of a centralized manner, or there wasn't a kind of coherent strategy for there hadn't been a coherent strategy for doing that. So I think those two things, and that's if you look at cloud, obviously Microsoft, Google, Amazon are the big three in terms of cloud providers. They are now and will continue to be providing essential kind of health infrastructure in much the way that like sanitation infrastructure was core infrastructure or a public health system in the past. So that aligns the long-term interests, I think, naturally at a very fundamental level of large technology organizations and large healthcare organizations. And then I think at the applied level, like sitting on top of that, it's, and I have some bias here because I'm more on the kind of entrepreneurship side myself. It's a question of how does big tech and government work to try and create the conditions, much as Amy and June have identified, and continued commitment to doing that, to make sure the best ideas that may be coming from individual clinicians, individual healthcare organizations, startups can get to scale, which is obviously, there's a bunch of challenges in doing that in healthcare. It takes a long time. Thank you.
Amy, your thoughts? Any key requests, recommendations for this community before us today?
First piece is on the equitable AI, the reminder that not only do we need the data sets to build algorithms, those data sets need to be representative and not biased, and we need to measure that bias, but then we need to also constantly evaluate the performance of the algorithms that we're building to ensure that the algorithms perform as expected and themselves do not lead to more bias in healthcare. So that part I think we need to see as foundational. My ask and my encouragement to this research community is to think about how we can leverage AI not just to build SAMD products, but AI to actually help to solve a lot of the problems and challenges across, especially the evidence generation space. That includes AI to help us curate data sets, AI to help us run better clinical trials, whether that's operational efficiency or AI-based informed clinical trials and Bayesian trials, for example. We also should be thinking about AI to help us build, for example, novel endpoints like digital endpoints. All of these need to be tested. We need to make sure that these AI-based solutions, again, lead to better evidence generation, faster, smarter, and not biased. But I submit that one of the ways to get to more equitable healthcare is to make sure that we develop more products that actually work for everyone, and AI can be a part of the solution set for building those products.
Thank you. And last but not least, June, your thoughts?
Well, the principle we embrace every day in regulation is regulation follows science. And as we face these immense opportunities, and this panel debate has really flagged some of the tough questions, but huge opportunities, I think the big ask is let's travel together. It is going to be quite a journey. We're excited now. We'll probably reach a stage of thinking some of this is impossible. But I think if we travel it together, we will actually, with our interdependencies, we will achieve great things. At the MHRA, we realise the enormity of what we're looking at. And so we're publishing a roadmap, as you do as a regulator, with broken down work packages that together we can start to tussle with the questions. We've heard a whole range, a panoply of things that we all say, yes, we must do this. We need the clean data sets. In the UK, we've got the benefit of the National Health Service and the data it holds as a test bed, like the recovery trial. And we can make synthetic data sets from data that we hold. We can use AI ourselves. There's nothing like using tools yourself, as we did in the pandemic, that demonstrates we're bought in. We want to be part of this amazing world. And so, single message, let's travel together.
Thank you. And my sincere thanks to all of you for this immensely rich discussion and for being part of our extended Healthcare Futures community and family. It's been a real pleasure to speak with all of you today, and my thanks to you and for the audience for their engagement in our session. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.